Welcome to Taste of Revenge. If you're into cold revenge and dark justice, hit that subscribe and like button. This story will haunt you.
My name is Cole Maddox, and what you're about to hear is the story of how I was humiliated, discarded, and betrayed by the very people who should have stood by me, and how I made sure they never forgot what they did. Sit back and let me tell you my story and how I got revenge. I was always the guy who blended into the background. Not invisible exactly, just the one no one ever expected much from. I wasn't the star quarterback, the class valedictorian, or the kid with a trust fund waiting after graduation. I was just Cole. I got by, kept my head down, did what I was told. Growing up in a small town like Halden Ridge, your reputation is everything. And once you get labeled, good luck shaking it. My family, we weren't respected. My dad worked construction when he could get it, and my mom cleaned houses. My brother Caleb had the same dreams as me. The Maddox name didn't open doors. It made people lock them. Still, I had dreams. I wanted out, wanted more, and I worked my ass off for it. I got a partial scholarship to Calmere Tech. Not Ivy League, but for a kid from my street, it was everything. I packed up my second-hand duffel, hugged my mom goodbye, and promised her I'd make something of myself. The first year was rough. I didn't fit in, not socially, not financially. While other kids drove Teslas, I rode the campus shuttle. But I didn't care. I kept my head in the books, took every odd job I could find, and pulled all-nighters like my life depended on it. Because it did. By sophomore year, things started clicking. Professors knew my name. I landed a paid research position in the engineering lab. I even got invited to a few off-campus parties, mostly by people who wanted help with their projects. But still, it felt like I was finally earning my place. And then came her. Avery Linwood. She was everything I wasn't. Wealthy, confident, a legacy student whose father had a lecture hall named after him. The kind of girl who turned heads, without even trying. We met during a group assignment in our systems engineering course. I thought she'd roll her eyes at me, the scholarship kid, but she didn't. She laughed at my jokes, asked about my background, listened when I spoke. And, somehow, we clicked. Before I knew it, we were studying late, grabbing coffee between classes, sharing playlists and secrets. She said she liked how grounded I was, how real. She hated all the fake people in her circle, said I was the only one who didn't want anything from her. I wanted her. Not her last name, not her money. Her. And for a while, I thought maybe she wanted me too. Until the night of the gala. Every year, Calmere held a spring gala, a black tie fundraiser for alumni and donors. Avery invited me, said it would be low-key, said I belonged there. I spent my last $120 renting a tux from a sketchy shop off campus. I even borrowed cologne from my roommate. I showed up early, palms sweating, heart pounding. And then I saw them. Avery, her friends, and her fiancé. I froze. There he was, all sharp jawline, perfectly gelled hair, and a watch that probably cost more than my tuition, laughing with her father, kissing Avery on the cheek. Fiancé. She never said anything, not once. I stepped back, heart pounding in my ears. My collar suddenly felt too tight, my rented shoes too small. The whole room spun, and for a second I considered walking straight out. But I didn't. I stayed. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see what else she lied about. The speeches started. Her father stood on stage, microphone in hand, beaming with pride. We're thrilled to announce our daughter Avery's engagement to the brilliant and accomplished Nathan Prescott, he said as cameras flashed. Applause. Champagne clinks. And me, still standing by the bar like a ghost. Avery didn't even look in my direction, like I didn't exist. Like the late-night talks, the stolen kisses in the library stairwell, the promises whispered between textbooks, were all fiction. The worst part? I believed her. She told me I was different, that I made her feel seen, that she didn't want the life her family laid out for her. But in the end, she chose it, chose him. That night, something shifted in me. The pain didn't come in a flood, it came in sharp little fragments. 1,000 cracks in a foundation I thought was solid. And I knew this wasn't just about her, it was about every time I was told I wasn't enough. Every door that slammed in my face. Every smirk from people who thought they were better just because of a name. She made a fool of me. But I wasn't going to stay the fool. Let's get something straight. I didn't want revenge to hurt her. I wanted her to remember me. To realize that the boy she dismissed was the man who'd rise far above her designer heels and curated life. And I wanted to do it quietly. No grand gestures, no shouting matches. Just precision. Cold, clean, undeniable. I started with research, not on her fiancé. Nathan Prescott. Turns out, Nathan's accomplishments were more family connections than earned merit. His startup, funded by his uncle. His tech patents, licensed, not invented. His online following, bought. I found cracks in his portfolio, gaps in his timelines, whispered rumors from former interns. And more importantly, I found his weakness, legacy. He needed to look perfect. So I made him look fake. I created a fake developer profile, someone claiming to be a co-founder that Nathan pushed out. Then I had a few burner accounts begin asking questions under his LinkedIn posts. Polite at first, just enough to plant doubt. Then came the anonymous Medium article, The Mask of Silicon Valley's Favorite Son. No names, just details, timelines. Subtle nods only industry insiders would catch. The kind of thing that spreads fast. It didn't take long. Within days, Twitter was whispering. Reddit was dissecting. Journalists were circling. And Avery? Still blissfully unaware. Until the day her father pulled her aside during brunch and whispered something that made her eyes widen. I know because I was there. Not seated near them, of course, but I'd chosen my table on the patio carefully. Back to them, mirrored sunglasses on, just another solo brunch-goer with a laptop. I watched her face pale. She scanned the crowd as if someone had just dropped a ghost into her world. She didn't see me, but I saw everything. Here's the thing about being forgotten. It gives you freedom. Nobody expects anything from you. You can move without being watched, plan without interference, evolve in silence. I stopped trying to be noticed, and instead started becoming undeniable. The new me didn't beg to be seen. He built. I launched my own startup. Small, lean, but sharp. Solving a real problem. I didn't need headlines or family connections. I needed product-market fit and ruthless discipline. 6 months in, we went viral on Product Hunt. A year later, I received a LinkedIn message from Jordan. Investors started calling. Tech blogs ran features like, "Where did he come from?" Funny thing was, even when I was everywhere, Avery still didn't recognize me. Until the gala. Oh, the gala. The Prescott Foundation's annual Future Leaders Gala was the event, the kind you don't just walk into. But now, I was on the guest list. Not as a +1, not as someone's intern, as a guest of honor. My startup had just partnered with a major sustainability firm. My name was on the program, my photo in the slideshow. And when Avery walked in, flawless as ever in her shimmering emerald gown, she froze. Finally. She saw me. Not as the boy she once loved and dismissed, but as the man she couldn't ignore. Avery didn't approach me right away. She kept glancing over, like she couldn't decide if she was seeing a ghost or a glitch in her memory. Her perfect brows knit together, her champagne flute trembling just slightly. I smiled, politely, detached, and turned back to the VP of our newest partner firm. We were discussing the environmental impact metrics of our last quarter, but I felt her stare like heat on my skin. Later, when the speeches started, I caught her in the corner of my eye. She was seated with her father, her posture impeccable, her smile a little too strained. I waited, and sure enough, she came to me during dessert. "Cole?" she asked, voice cautious. I turned, feigning surprise just the right amount. "Avery, wow, it's been, 8 years?" "More like 10. She gave a laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look different." "I get that a lot." I sipped my water calmly. "You look exactly the same." She hesitated, clearly unsure if that was a compliment. "Congratulations, by the way," she added quickly, "on everything." "Thanks," I nodded. "It's been a good year." A pause. Then she asked, softer, "Why didn't you ever reach out?" That was the moment. Right there. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Because I had nothing left to prove." And if you think that conversation closed a chapter, it didn't. It opened a door. You see, Avery had spent a decade rising up, polishing her brand, building a world that didn't include me. She thought she'd erased me from her narrative. But now? Now she had to explain me. To her friends. To her fiancé. To her father. And the more they asked, the more awkward her answers became. For the first few weeks after my resignation, the silence was deafening. No emails, no phone calls, not even a hollow, "We're sorry to see you go" message. It was like I'd been erased, a ghost in a company I helped build. The team I once led with pride had moved on like I never existed. But I wasn't done. While they were busy celebrating their little kingdom, I was documenting every late payment they made to vendors, every falsified performance report, every discriminatory hiring decision masked behind jargon. I knew where the skeletons were buried. I helped bury some of them. Still, I wasn't interested in going public just yet. Revenge isn't about noise. It's about precision. I started small. I sent a gift basket to the office, addressed to my former boss. Inside was a simple note. "For 5 years, I carried your weight. Let's see how well you walk without me." I heard from a friend still inside that he went pale when he read it. Weeks turned to months. I kept tabs from a distance, watching as the cracks slowly formed in their foundation. The quarterly numbers dropped. Their star client, a logistics giant, suddenly pulled out of a $3 million contract because I'd tipped them off to the late deliverables and internal chaos. But it still wasn't enough. They hadn't felt what I felt. One night, staring at the ceiling, I realized what I really wanted: for them to face the same humiliation they served me, in front of the same audience that once applauded their lies. So I reached out to HR. I posed as a journalist writing a piece on corporate success stories. I requested interviews with key players from the company, including my former manager, under the guise of showcasing leadership under pressure. They couldn't resist the bait. A month later, the piece went live, but it wasn't a puff piece. It was an exposé. I published anonymized testimonies from other ex-employees, detailed timelines of shady practices, and even financial discrepancies, all backed by documents I had copied before leaving. The backlash was instant. Stockholders panicked. Clients started pulling out. The CEO made a clumsy statement, but it only fueled the fire. And I wasn't finished yet. Around this time, I received an email. No subject line, no sender name I recognized. It simply read, "We need to talk. Please." It was from Grace. Grace had been my protégé once. Smart, ethical, maybe too green for the corporate games we played. She had stayed when I left, probably thinking she could fix things from the inside. She was wrong. We met at a quiet cafe on a rainy afternoon. Her hands shook as she stirred her tea. "They're collapsing," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Legal's all over them. The board wants heads, and they're blaming you." I smiled. "Let them." She looked at me, eyes filled with something between fear and admiration. They said if I could get you to stop talking, they'd make me head of operations. I leaned back, letting the weight of her words settle. And what do you want, Grace? She blinked. I wanted to fix it. I thought staying meant I could change things, but it's too rotten. You were right to leave. I nodded slowly. I'm not going to stop, I said quietly, not until the last brick falls. I took a deep breath before opening the door to the boardroom. The room fell quiet. Not because I was late. I wasn't. Not because I was dressed any differently. I wore the same navy slacks and button-up I always did, but because I wasn't supposed to be here. Not after what happened. 6 months ago, I was the rising star of Aldridge and Rowe, the kind of employee they referenced in onboarding speeches. Be like Cole, they'd say. Tenacity, humility, results. That was before the promotion list came out. Before every rumor turned real. Before the meeting with Howard. He didn't even flinch when he said it. Cole, we're going a different direction. A different direction apparently meant his nephew, Travis. A guy whose only real skill was laughing loudly at bad jokes. A guy who asked me for help formatting Excel files a week before they made him my superior. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was angry, though I was, but because I felt erased. I gave them everything. I stayed late, skipped weekends, led client teams while battling migraines. I trained Travis. I covered for his mistakes. I kept thinking, if I mattered, why was I disposable? But life has a funny way of flipping the script when you learn to wait in silence. I didn't quit. I asked to be moved to special projects, a graveyard division for people too polite to protest. That's where I learned, watched, took notes, found cracks. Because sometimes revenge isn't a scream, it's a whisper that builds. One of those whispers came from Lisa in accounting. You should see this, she said one afternoon, sliding a file across the table. Inside were numbers, lots of them. More than just bad budgeting. They weren't just cooking the books. They were seasoning them, sautéing them, and serving them with garnish. Offshore accounts. Fake vendors. And Travis? His signature was on at least 9 of the transactions. I didn't go to HR. I didn't alert compliance. I watched. And I kept watching for months. Until the day of the quarterly board review. That morning, I ironed my shirt twice, smoothed my hair, then walked into the boardroom like a ghost they'd forgotten existed. Everyone turned, even Travis. Didn't know you were joining us, Cole, he said with a grin. I'm here to present, I replied, voice steady, special projects update. Howard raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I stepped to the screen and plugged in my flash drive. Slide 1, a benign project summary. Slide 2, department efficiencies. Slide 3, line items from the fraud ledger, names, dates, dollar amounts, vendor receipts. Silence. I didn't look up until slide 7 when I heard a chair scrape violently. Travis was pale. Howard's lips parted. I've prepared a full report, which I'll be forwarding to internal legal after this meeting, I said, turning off the screen. Unless you'd prefer we discuss next steps now. No one moved. Lisa smiled from her corner seat. Afterward, I walked down the hallway slowly. I didn't slam the door or shout triumphantly. I didn't have to. Sometimes, quiet resolve speaks louder than any shout. When those who owed me their success cast me aside, I understood my silence was a strategy. The greatest revenge was the victory they never anticipated. The fallout began within hours. By the time I returned to my desk, 3 senior partners had already requested meetings with legal. HR sent me a vague thank you for your diligence email, the kind that feels like a pat on the back from a stranger. I ignored it. I wasn't in it for the thanks. The building felt different that day, colder, or maybe I was just seeing it without the fog of loyalty. Every hallway I once walked with purpose now felt like a museum of people pretending. Then the worst part? They all knew. Not just about the fraud, about me, that I was the one who pulled the pin. Travis didn't show up the next day. Rumor had it he'd been suspended pending investigation. By Friday, his office was empty, not cleared out. Empty like it had never been his. They erased him faster than they ever erased me. Poetic. Howard, however, was harder to shake. He didn't step down, but he did step back, suddenly taking, quote, personal leave. A new face was brought in to evaluate operational integrity. Corporate speak for, figure out what the hell happened. And I? I was offered a quiet promotion. No announcement, no company-wide email. Just a folded letter slid across a desk offering me a new title, a raise, and a corner office. Like they were trying to bandage the wound without acknowledging the knife. I didn't accept. Not right away. Instead, I asked to speak directly to the board. They granted me 10 minutes. I used 9. I told them what I saw, what I reported, and what I endured. I didn't ask for pity. I asked for change. Real change. Not the kind that shuffles titles around, but leaves the rot untouched. And then I walked out. Not out of the company. Out of the meeting. And back to my desk, where a note waited for me in Lisa's handwriting. Told you they'd blink first. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. But the real satisfaction didn't come from their fear. It came later. Much later. About 3 months after the fallout, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. "Mr. Maddox?" the voice asked. "Yes." "This is Detective Marin with the Financial Crimes Division." I froze. "We're conducting a broader investigation based on documents submitted by your firm," he continued. "Your name was flagged as a critical source. We'd like your cooperation and possibly your testimony." I agreed. Because what they did wasn't just unethical. It was criminal. And people needed to know. Over the next few weeks, I sat in a dozen interviews, handed over every file I had, and answered every question. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I just told the truth. The fallout became federal. And the silence I carried for months? It turned into a weapon they never saw coming. I wasn't trying to become a hero. Heroes wear capes and get thanked. What I did? It came with anonymous threats, awkward silences in elevators, and the quiet unraveling of old alliances. People who used to wave suddenly found their phones fascinating when I walked by. Others, who once joked with me over coffee, now held their breath until I passed. And I understood why. It's easy to admire the truth from a distance, but when someone brings it into your building, where it can seep into your walls and shake loose the polished plaques in your hallway, admiration turns to fear. But I never let it change me. Instead, I worked. I showed up early, left late, cleaned up messes that weren't mine, and built systems that wouldn't need cleaning again. I earned back trust without ever demanding it. Eventually, that quiet effort got noticed. I was brought into higher-level meetings, not as a token, but as a necessity. My insight was no longer a risk. It was an asset. That's when I knew the tide had fully turned. Not when I got the office. Not when I saw Travis's name scraped off the directory. But when people who once ignored my warnings started quoting them in boardrooms as if they were their own ideas. I could have called them out. But I didn't. Because this was bigger than credit. It was about impact. In that moment, I realized the ones who mocked me had taken my words, but a quiet voice inside assured me the truth outlasts their fleeting applause. My life outside work changed too. For months, I had avoided the mirror, not literally. I still got dressed, still checked my tie, but I avoided seeing myself. Really seeing. Because the man who'd been broken wasn't gone. He was hiding. Until one morning, as I straightened my jacket, I caught a glimpse of him, not the shattered version, but the one who rebuilt something stronger from the pieces. And for the first time in a long time, I nodded at him. I was proud. I never sought revenge in the traditional sense. No screaming matches. No slammed doors. Just quiet, relentless progress. And somehow, that hurt them more. I know because of the emails. Anonymous. Cryptic. Must be nice, getting your way. Hope the spotlight keeps you warm. Enjoy it while it lasts. They were weak attempts to shake me. But they failed. Because when you've already survived silence, whispers can't touch you. The meeting was over by noon, and as the room emptied, I stayed behind a moment longer. I watched them go, one by one, laughing, shaking hands, making plans I was no longer invited to. That used to be me. I used to be in the center of those circles. But now, I was orbiting on the outside. Colder, sharper. Back at my desk, the silence welcomed me like an old friend. I didn't rush into my next move. I studied. I listened. I watched patterns in the office. I noticed whose computer screens never locked. I saw whose passwords were written on post-it notes tucked beneath keyboards. I learned who stayed late and who always left early. I wasn't planning anything illegal. Not yet. I was building leverage. People talked when they thought I was invisible. They forgot I was there. That's when they told the truth. I kept a private journal, not digital, a real one, leather-bound, hidden inside the hollow of an old product manual nobody had touched in years. Every note, every whisper, every odd transaction. I wrote it down, not to use yet, but to remember who they really were, beneath the wine toasts and mission statements. It's funny how much dirt a company gathers when it thinks it's on top. There was one executive, Paul Granger, slick hair, slick smile, and even slicker connections. He was the golden boy, the one who never got his hands dirty. But I'd seen the expense reports. I'd seen the dates, the double charges, the names listed under client entertainment, who were anything but clients. I didn't say a word. I just watched. Then came the annual Employee Recognition Gala, a black-tie evening meant to honor the pillars of the company. The irony was unbearable. They gave plaques and speeches, toasted loyalty, praised the culture. I was invited, not because they respected me, but because they thought I'd behave. They still didn't know what I had planned. That night, I wore confidence, like perfume. I walked in alone, but I didn't feel alone. I had the weight of every truth they'd buried, tucked neatly into my briefcase. During dinner, I politely applauded as they gave awards to people who hadn't earned them. I smiled when they mentioned the resilient team spirit. I nodded as Gerald, yes, Gerald, stood on stage to give the keynote. He had the audacity to talk about ethics. I remained steady. When he stepped off stage and saw me, his smile faltered for a split second, just a flicker, but I caught it. He knew I wasn't there to clap. What he didn't know was that the USB drive in my briefcase held the financial inconsistencies of 5 major execs, including him. And the letter I'd mailed earlier that day? It was addressed to the board of directors, with proof. I didn't need to cause a scene. That wasn't my style. Instead, I stood and raised a toast. Calm, collected. To the ones who make this company what it truly is, I said, letting my eyes rest just a moment longer on Paul. To the people behind the curtains, the ones who really built this place, and the ones who will always be remembered, for better or worse. Some laughed. Paul didn't. The rest of the night moved in slow motion. Laughter clinked off champagne glasses. The jazz band played something smooth and forgettable. But I didn't sit back down. I walked out of that ballroom like it was the last time I'd ever stepped foot in it. And maybe it was. 2 days later, the first cracks appeared. An anonymous report reached the board, encrypted, detailed, signed only with 3 words. Your silence speaks. Paul called an emergency meeting. Faces that had always worn smugness now wore concern. Paul Granger looked pale. HR scrambled. Accounting went into lockdown. "And me?" I called in sick. Let them sweat. By the end of the week, whispers became roars. Internal investigations were launched. A few execs took sudden medical leaves. Paul disappeared from meetings. His calendar cleared overnight. I watched it all unfold from a distance. And just when they thought the storm had passed, I sent the second package. This one wasn't anonymous. This one had my name on it. This letter bore my name, Cole Maddox. You erased me. You mocked me. You replaced me. But while you were celebrating your stolen victories, I was watching, recording. And now, I'm taking back what you tried to destroy. That letter didn't go to the board. It went to every single employee. Inbox by inbox, unfiltered, uncensored. Screenshots, audio files, dates, numbers, proof. Not to bring the company down, just to show the truth. The aftermath? 3 resignations within 24 hours. Paul? Quietly removed. No goodbye email, no plaque. Paul? Under audit. The new Employee of the Year award? Canceled indefinitely. And me? I got offers. From rivals, from partners, even from the media. But I didn't respond. Because revenge isn't about recognition. It's about knowing you were never the problem. They were just afraid you'd realize it. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual. The parking lot was mostly empty, the sky still bruised with the remnants of dawn. I walked through the corridors like a ghost. My polished shoes echoed, breaking the silence. I had spent most of the night reviewing data, combing through performance metrics and preparing a dossier so sharp it could cut glass. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to make my exit unforgettable. By the time the rest of the staff began trickling in, I had already printed out 50 sealed envelopes. Each contained a personalized performance breakdown, a document detailing how I had increased the company's margins, improved retention, and even prevented a data breach 3 months ago that nobody had even noticed. I left each envelope on the desks of the people who had laughed during that boardroom ambush. No signature, no note. Just numbers, the kind that made mouths shut and eyes widen. And then I waited. At 10 a.m., I entered the office kitchen to get coffee. I could feel eyes on me, the kind that carried guilt, confusion, curiosity. I didn't flinch. I didn't smirk. I just poured my coffee and returned to my desk like nothing had changed. But everything had. At noon, I walked into Mr. Harlan's office. He was in the middle of a call, but when he saw me, his eyes narrowed. "I'll call you back," he muttered into the phone and hung up. I placed a sleek black folder on his desk. "What's this?" he asked. "My final report, and my resignation." He leaned back, brows raised. "So you're quitting?" I didn't blink. "No, I'm transitioning." "To what?" "To someone you'll wish you never underestimated." He scoffed, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. I knew that twitch. It meant uncertainty. And men like him hated uncertainty more than anything. "I'm also requesting a copy of the company's exit interview forms," I added. "HR is obligated to conduct one, isn't it?" His nostrils flared. "Fine. We'll set it up." "Perfect. And I'd like a copy of my personnel file as well. I'm sure it's glowing." With that, I turned and walked out, his silence louder than any insult he'd ever hurled. Back at my desk, I logged out of every system, cleared my browser history, deleted cached passwords, and removed any lingering scripts or automation I had written that the company was still relying on. They would figure it out eventually, but not today. Today, they'd believe they still had access. They didn't. I left behind one last thing, a USB drive taped under my desk, with every design file, every marketing draft, and every campaign I had ever touched. All organized. All labeled. A goodbye gift to the one intern who never mocked me, never joined the whispering. Some people deserve to inherit the tools of your empire. Others deserve to watch it crumble without you. They'll call you quiet, dismiss you, mock you, until one day your silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. I stepped out of the building into the cool afternoon sun. My phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Harlan. When can we talk? I think there's a way to work this out. I deleted it without reading the rest. He didn't know it yet, but he was the past. And I was already busy building something he'd never be able to touch. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to a small overlook on the edge of town, the kind of place where couples carved initials into railings and teenagers smoked secrets into the wind. It was quiet there, peaceful, and more than anything, it was mine. I parked the car and just sat, watching the town stretch beneath me like a map of every step I had taken to get here, every betrayal, every lie, every fake smile I'd swallowed like poison. And then I opened my laptop. I had already registered the domain. I had already chosen the name. I had already started building my own agency, one where the rules were mine, where talent wasn't overlooked, because it didn't come wrapped in charm or connections. A place where people like me, people who worked in silence and bled in private, could turn strategy into firepower. It wasn't just about leaving. It was about proving I didn't need their world. I could build my own. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a ghost online. I updated my LinkedIn with a vague title, declined all connection requests from former colleagues, and scrubbed mentions of my previous job from every platform. But behind that curtain, I was a machine. I worked 16-hour days, slept in intervals, and poured every ounce of strategy, design, and fire I had into launching my first client's campaign, a small skincare brand run by a single mother in Detroit. She didn't have funding, but she had grit, and I respected that, because it looked a lot like me. Her campaign went viral. Sales quadrupled in a month. And I didn't just help her business grow, I helped her believe she wasn't small. It was a mirror. The word started spreading quietly. No flashy ads, no press releases, just whispers. There's someone out there who can make your brand unstoppable. She doesn't talk much, but she delivers. It was better than revenge. It was rebirth. A month later, I received a LinkedIn message from Jordan, the golden boy who took my promotion. Hey, not sure if you remember me, LOL, but I'd love to connect. I might be looking for freelance help on a project soon. I read it twice, then once more for the satisfaction. I didn't respond. Instead, I took a screenshot, added it to a private folder I called Receipts and Roses. Because sometimes the loudest revenge isn't destruction. It's success they can't touch. And when the company I left began trying to copy the very systems I once built, releasing campaigns that looked eerily similar, launching products that felt like my drafts, I didn't panic. I smiled. Because they were still watching me, still trying to catch up, and still missing the point. You don't follow a ghost. You follow a legacy. I started getting invitations, podcasts, panels, brand workshops. At first, I turned them all down. I wasn't ready to be seen. Not yet. I liked the quiet power, the anonymity. But then I realized something. Silence had served its purpose. Now it was time they heard my name. So I picked one, a brand strategy summit in New York. Not one of those flashy influencer expos. A real room. Suits. CEOs. Creatives who had built empires from ideas. I walked in alone. No assistant. No entourage. Just me, a navy suit with a sharp tie, and a reputation that had grown louder than any scream I could have mustered in that boardroom. They didn't recognize me at first. Then came the stares. Whispers. That awful pause of memory hitting someone like a cold slap. And then, the keynote. I wasn't just attending. I was the headliner. I walked onto that stage like it belonged to me, because it did. I spoke about building from nothing, about silent momentum, about how the loudest brands are often the ones that forget who they're speaking to. I told them, your story is your weapon. Sharpen it quietly, then cut clean. The applause was thunderous. After the talk, A man approached me, early 40s, well-groomed and unmistakably uncomfortable. He held out his hand with a shaky smile. "Cole, right? We used to work together, I think, at the firm." I took his hand, held it just long enough for him to feel how steady mine was. "I remember," I said, smiling. "You were the one who forwarded my proposal with your name on it." His mouth opened, then shut again. No excuse. No defense. Just a man realizing the mirror never forgets the face that looked away. He didn't say anything. Just gave a weak laugh and muttered something about how things were different back then. I let him squirm. I didn't need to correct him. Time had already done that for me. Later that evening, after the summit wrapped, I was sipping wine at the rooftop bar when I got a message. Blocked number. Just 5 words. "You really think you won?" I stared at the screen for a moment, then laughed. Because the real win wasn't a stage, or applause, or recognition. The real win was not needing to reply. The real win was being so far ahead they had to reach back just to throw a stone. I turned off my phone, looked out at the city skyline. Felt nothing but peace. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply done. And that's the kind of ending they never prepare for. When you walk away, not because you lost, but because you outgrew the war. The next morning, I checked out of the hotel with no plans to return anytime soon. A few colleagues asked if I'd be attending the closing brunch, but I smiled politely and said I had a flight to catch. I didn't. I just didn't need to be anywhere. I wasn't celebrated. Instead, I went to a quiet cafe tucked behind the opera house, the kind of place where no one knew my name and no one expected anything from me. Just a latte, a notebook, and time. As I sat by the window, watching the world pass without me, I finally opened the letter. The one I'd been carrying for 2 years. It was from Jordan. A real letter, handwritten in ink. I'd read it dozens of times before, but something about reading it now, after all that had happened, made it hit differently. I was wrong. About everything. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, and I don't expect you to. But I want you to know that what you did, it saved us. And I never gave you the credit you deserved. It ended with a number. No name, just a number. I never called. Some ghosts are better left silent. Seeing others take credit for my struggles taught me patience. Life, in its quiet way, writes the record on my own terms. I tucked the letter back into my coat pocket. Not out of nostalgia, but out of closure. I wasn't angry at Jordan anymore. I wasn't bitter at my parents. I wasn't chasing applause. I was simply remembering who I was before they taught me to doubt it. That's the thing about revenge. The best kind isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't slap. It doesn't even need an audience. It just is. And it stays. Long after they've forgotten the lie. Long after the applause has faded. Long after the stage lights dim, your silence will still be echoing in their heads. I finished my coffee, closed my notebook, walked into the sunlight, not as someone who needed to prove anything, but as someone they could never erase. I wish I could say that was the end of it. A coffee, a closure, and a clean slate. But the past has a strange way of folding back into your present, especially when you least expect it. A week later, I received a message request on an old social account I hadn't touched in months. The name stopped me. Mira Holloway. Not someone I ever expected to hear from again. Not after what she'd done. Not after what we had both lost. Back then, she had been my mentor's golden child. Sharp, polished, cunning, and ruthless enough to cut anyone standing in her spotlight. We started as interns together, grew through the same ranks, ate lunch in the same miserable corner of the break room for 3 years. And then one day, she got promoted over me for a project I had led, a client I had brought in, and a result she had watched from the sidelines. She didn't even have the decency to hide it. I remembered the look in her eyes the day she delivered the team meeting, where my name and my efforts were never mentioned once. I sat across from her, frozen in my chair, while the whole boardroom clapped. And she smiled, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It took me months to stop replaying that moment. And here she was, on my screen, saying, "Hey, I heard about the wedding. I wasn't there, but I saw some of the posts. I'd love to catch up if you're open to it." That was all. Just a casual reach out. No apology. No explanation. Like nothing ever happened. I stared at the message for a full 10 minutes. Then I deleted it. No anger. No response. Just silence. That silence was more powerful than any reply I could have typed. 2 days later, another message. From someone else. This time, the woman who had married my sister, Angela. I didn't know much about her. She always kept her distance, stayed in the shadows of our family events. Quiet, polite, observant. And the one person in that wedding hall who had looked at me with something that almost resembled guilt. Her message wasn't long either. I saw what they did. You didn't deserve any of it. I'm sorry for the role I played, even unknowingly. If you ever want to talk, you can reach me here. Cole. It was the first time in years someone from that circle had used my name without venom. Still, I didn't respond, because by now I'd learned something most people never do. You don't always have to open doors just because someone knocks. Sometimes healing isn't about fixing broken bridges. It's about building new ones in places they can't reach. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't need their regrets. They weren't tickets to my peace. They were receipts. Proof of what they owed, not what I lacked. I booked a flight that evening, not because I needed to run, but because I was ready to move. New city, new project. No more explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I rented a small loft on the edge of town, the kind with creaky floors and a view of nothing in particular. I filled it with quiet music, strong coffee, and notebooks I actually wrote in. I took long walks in the morning, learned to cook things I'd always ordered, spoke to strangers on the street, laughed without worrying about who might be watching. And slowly, the scar on my reputation faded. Not because people changed their minds, but because I stopped needing them to. A month later, I was invited to speak at a university panel, ironically, about resilience in career and identity. I stood on the stage, looking out at rows of young faces, some eager, some tired, all searching. I began simply. My name is Cole Maddox, and for a long time I thought survival was enough. But I've come to learn, being forgotten is not the worst thing that can happen. Being misremembered is. There was silence in the room, a heavy, listening kind. I was once erased from my own story, I continued, by colleagues, by mentors, by people I thought had my back. But the truth is, they didn't erase me, they just gave me a blank page, and I wrote something they couldn't. The applause was slow, then rising. I didn't smile to impress them. I smiled because it was true. After the talk, a student approached me, nervous, backpack slung forward, eyes wide behind smudged glasses. "Mr. Maddox," he said quietly, "can I ask something?" I nodded. "How do you stop being angry at people who never even noticed they broke you?" I paused. That question had once kept me up at night. "You don't," I told him. "You just stop needing them to understand. Anger doesn't always disappear, but it does grow quieter when you start living for yourself." He nodded slowly, then smiled, a small, thankful curve of his lips. And in that moment, I saw myself, not the broken version, the one standing tall, offering a hand back. That night, I walked home under the soft orange hue of city lights, thinking about how far I'd come. I didn't have everything figured out, but I had myself. And I wasn't a question mark anymore. I was a sentence. A declaration. And I wasn't done writing. A week passed. Then 2. Life became pleasantly uneventful. I was no longer bracing for the next betrayal, no longer rehearsing defenses in my head. My mornings were calm. My nights, quiet. Until one evening, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. It was my sister's voice. "Cole, I don't know why I'm calling. I know I probably have no right to. But I saw the video from your panel. Someone posted a clip. You looked strong, and I didn't realize how far gone we were until I heard your voice, and it didn't sound like someone I knew anymore. I guess I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the silence, for everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I hope you're okay." She ended the call with a deep inhale, like she was holding back words she couldn't let herself say. I didn't cry. I didn't replay it 100 times. I saved it once. Then I left it alone. I wasn't angry anymore. But I wasn't ready either. Forgiveness, I'd come to learn, wasn't a door you opened for others. It was a window you cracked for yourself when you were ready to breathe. And right now, I was still in the room, airing it out. That weekend, I was invited to a local event, a charity auction for a community program I once helped design, back when I still worked under Paul. Funny how they used to keep me off the guest list. Now they were offering me the mic. I wore confidence like armor that night. A tailored navy suit, cufflinks sharp as memory, shoes that echoed against marble floors. And when I walked in, Paul was there, standing at the bar, surrounded by people who used to laugh too loud at his jokes. They were older now, tired in the eyes, smiles that didn't quite reach the edge anymore. He turned. Our eyes met. And I swear, the room went quiet. Not because anyone hushed it, but because some silences don't ask permission. He took a step toward me, then another. "Cole," he said, his voice small, brittle, like old glass. "I didn't expect." "You never did," I replied. There was a pause, a beat of time where 1,000 memories collided in the space between us. "I watched the interview," he said finally. "The one from the university. You looked well." I didn't answer. Because I didn't owe him my healing. When they only saw my value after I was beyond their reach, a resolve grew within me. I was never theirs to claim. He cleared his throat, glanced around like he needed witnesses to validate our conversation. "I've been thinking about everything. What happened, the way we ended. I just wanted to say..." "Don't," I cut in. "Don't rewrite history now that you're uncomfortable living with the truth." He looked like he wanted to protest, to defend, to deflect, the usual tools of his trade, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded, slowly. And for the first time in years, he looked small. I walked past him, not fast, not dramatic, just forward. Later that night, someone handed me a glass of wine and said, "You know, you're kind of a legend around here now." I smiled. "Only now?" They laughed. "No, but it's just louder now." I went home alone. No lingering stares, no battles fought in bathroom mirrors, just me, in my space, safe. I stood in front of my window, city lights blinking back like quiet applause. Not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped needing to prove I had. I didn't expect to see her there. When I walked through the doors of that boardroom, expecting the usual stoic suits and awkward greetings, there she was, Lydia, sitting in my old chair like it belonged to her, like she hadn't twisted the knife in my back just a few months prior. She raised an eyebrow, calm as ever. That fake neutrality she wore like perfume still lingered in the air. But I noticed her hand twitch slightly. A micro-expression. I was trained to catch those. "Didn't expect you'd show up," she said coolly. I smiled. "You never did expect much from me." That shut her up. The room fell into a hush. Everyone sensed something under the surface, like the tension before a storm. They started the meeting anyway, trying to pretend this wasn't the most awkward reunion in corporate history. I stayed quiet, composed, taking notes, making eye contact with the right people, asking precise questions that exposed weak spots in Lydia's proposal. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by the person she thought she'd erased from the game. An hour in, she cracked. Voice clipped, cheeks flushed, defensive jargon spewing like a desperate fire hose. I waited, patient, until the final quarter of the meeting, when the client asked for additional insights, and I delivered. Data they hadn't seen, angles no one had explored, a narrative that was bulletproof, and I made sure to thank Lydia for laying the foundation during her rushed development cycle. The client laughed. She didn't. After the meeting, she cornered me near the elevators. "You think this is over?" she hissed. I leaned in slightly. "Lydia, this wasn't the revenge. This was the reminder. If you think that moment was the climax, you're wrong. That was just the fuse. The explosion came next." And oh, it echoed far beyond that building. Because what Lydia didn't know was that I wasn't just here to win a meeting. I was here to expose a truth she thought was buried. One I'd been saving for exactly the right moment. It involved misused funds, a hidden audit, and a whistleblower file with her name on it, and mine carefully removed from every chain of evidence. But that part? You'll see why it mattered when her entire world collapsed. Not because I wanted her to suffer, but because she made sure I did first. Revenge wasn't my plan. It was just the only way left to speak the language they understood. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was anxious, but because something in me had shifted. That old version of myself, the one who sought approval, who explained too much, who stayed silent to keep the peace, was gone. What remained was colder, sharper, and honest in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in years. The next morning, I got a call from Internal Affairs. They wanted to follow up on some of the materials I had anonymously submitted 2 weeks ago. The same materials Lydia had sworn were deleted. Turns out, forensic recovery tools work wonders when you're 2 steps ahead. I gave them everything. Every file, every timestamp, every copy of misappropriated budgets and forged reports. I didn't have to embellish. The truth was already poisonous enough. By noon, Lydia was pulled from all active projects. By 4 p.m., she was escorted from the building. And by the end of the week, her face, the same smug expression that haunted me every time I doubted myself, was plastered across internal HR bulletins under the words, "Under investigation for breach of ethics." I didn't celebrate. There were no champagne toasts or smug selfies, just silence. But for the first time, it was the kind of silence that felt earned. I walked through the lobby 3 days later, passing the exact spot I had once stood shaking after she threw me under the bus in front of the board. Now? People held the door for me. Nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. And there, by the reception desk, was Kevin, the intern she used to bark at, now promoted, now confident, now looking at me like I had rewritten the rules. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" He hesitated. "For showing us what strength really looks like." I nodded and walked away. That night, I visited the rooftop. The same rooftop where I used to eat lunch alone, wondering if I was the problem. I stood at the edge and watched the city blink. And I knew something deeply, irrevocably true. When I felt my voice was ignored, I learned my actions would speak louder. The world recalls those who quietly refuse to shrink. Not long after, I left that company, on my own terms. I took offers from 2 competitors. I picked the one Lydia used to mock, said they were too small to matter. They gave me full creative control and a team that actually listened. And then, months later, during a leadership summit, I was asked to speak. I told a story, not by name, not out of spite, but about silence. About how revenge isn't fire and fury. It's precision and patience. It's choosing not to destroy someone, but to outlive the story they tried to write for you. And when I walked off that stage, someone in the front row stood up. Lydia's old mentor, He didn't say a word, just clapped. Because even he knew. Some reputations are built on fear. But the unforgettable ones? They're built on truth. The requests started trickling in not long after. One from an old colleague who had once avoided me in meetings. Another from a manager who'd voted against me when Lydia orchestrated my demotion. Now they were forwarding resumes, asking if there was space on my new team. Their messages were polite, humble, almost apologetic. Funny how people remember your name once it's attached to power. I didn't hold grudges, but I didn't forget either. I hired the intern who once cried in the supply closet after Lydia berated him over a typo. I hired the father who'd returned from paternity leave only to be sidelined by the same system I once feared. And I made one thing clear during onboarding. Titles don't impress me, but character does. Every now and then, someone would ask why I didn't retaliate harder, why I didn't go public, take Lydia to court, or burn the whole place down. Because they didn't understand. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about liberation. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's walking into a room they tried to keep you out of and being the one they now have to listen to. One morning, a message popped up on LinkedIn. No profile photo, just a name. Lydia. I stared at it for a long time. There was no apology. Just one line. You always were smarter than the rest of us. I didn't reply. I archived it, closed my laptop, and went back to writing the policy I was preparing for the mentorship program we just launched. Because Lydia was in my past. But I was the future. A few months later, I stood in front of an auditorium filled with young men. Some nervous, some skeptical, all of them watching me, expecting something. I took a breath, looked at the first row, thought of the scared version of myself that once sat in chairs like theirs, thinking the world was too loud, too sharp, too far above me to touch. And I spoke. I wasn't born confident. I was taught silence. I was taught to keep my head down, obey, not take up space. But silence doesn't protect you. It buries you. Eyes locked in. And I spent too many years buried under other people's stories. I let them write my ending until I picked up the pen. Scattered claps. Nods. One guy in the back wiped his eye with a sleeve. I smiled. If there's one thing I've learned, I continued, it's that your quiet doesn't make you weak. It makes you powerful if you know when to use it and when to break it. They rose with me in applause, not for who I had become, but for who they were beginning to believe they could be. And that was worth more than any revenge. That was the win. The speech ended. Applause still echoed in my ears as I stepped backstage, lightheaded with something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. But peace is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it kicks the door down. As I reached for my bag, I saw a white envelope tucked inside. No name, just my handwriting from years ago. My breath caught. I unfolded the paper. It was the letter I wrote that night before I left, the one I burned, the one no one should have ever read. And under it, another sheet, fresh ink. A note. I thought you'd want this back. I pulled it from the fire before it burned. I couldn't tell them, but I never forgot it either. I'm sorry for everything. Caleb. My brother. The only one who ever tried to speak up. The one I thought had turned his back on me, too. My knees buckled onto the bench. I held the letter like it was made of glass. And for the first time in years, I cried. Not from rage. Not from regret. But from release. Because maybe revenge isn't always about burning bridges. Sometimes it's just about showing them they never broke you. And now, they'll never forget me. Not because I screamed, but because I didn't have to.
If that hit you deep, imagine what's coming next.
Subscribe, like, and welcome to Taste of Revenge.